Welcome to The Edge. I'm joined by Chris Grove, gaming industry analyst. Chris, thanks for being with me today. If you would, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about some of the issues that that the sports betting industry is engaged in now, like some tax issues. Then talk a little bit about the future of sports betting and online casino gambling, if we could. But first, as you well know, 38 states and Washington, D.C. have legal sports betting. It seems to have sort of stalled there. Half of the Southeastern Conference states don't have it. Georgia, Oklahoma now is in the SEC, Texas. Where do we go, Chris, with sports betting? Are we stalled at 38? And then what happens to states like Texas and California, the two most populated states in the country, don't have legal sports betting?
It's important to remember that the expansion of sports betting up until this point really has been arguably the most rapid expansion of legalized gambling, at least in my lifetime. So it was inevitable at some point that pace was going to slow down. As you noted, 38 is a pretty healthy number out of 50. So the first problem is there are only so many states left. Second problem is the states that are left for a reason. Either there's a strain of cultural conservatism in those states that pushes back against any expansion of gambling, or you might have tribal gambling stakeholders who view any expansion of online gambling specifically, or you might just have a makeup of stakeholders in a particular state, whether that's BLT or route operators or horse racing or more localized retail operators that can't get on the same page. But the short way to say it is the states that are left for a reason, and I'm not sure that any of the states remaining are going to be low-hanging fruit at this point.
It could be a while. Ronnie Johns, the former Gaming Control Board, as you know, Gaming Control Board chairman of Louisiana, told me it may be the 2030s before Texas gets sports betting. Even Mattress Mac, the big sports bettor, told me as you mentioned, there are some political pushback from some religious groups and conservative groups in Texas, and then in California from the last election, the ballot issues. There are some commercial sports betting in tribal. There was a little bit of a loggerhead, which still may exist. Is there and the same in Oklahoma? There's some tribal issues. Is there going forward? Is that going to jam things up for a while? For instance, Chris, in states like Oklahoma and California, is it going to and to some degree in Florida, is it going to continue to be a sort of a tribal and commercial jockeying going on, or will that get smoothed out?
I'm not sure that it will necessarily get smoothed out. And look, the broader context here is that in any state, sports betting just isn't that important of a topic. It's important to us in the industry, but it is a second, third, fourth tier topic in the broader sense of all of the topics that are on the board for a state legislature in any given year. Sports betting isn't cracking the top 10, may not crack the top 50. And what happens as a result of that dynamic is that sports betting ultimately, or at least often, gets wrapped up in larger legislative discussions. It is a chip in a much more robust and complicated poker game. And sometimes that chip is utilized in broader political discussions that have nothing to do with gambling. Other times, as is the case in Texas, you see sports betting get tied into broader questions of gambling expansion. In the case of Texas, that's the idea of bringing casino resorts, integrated resorts down to Texas. So there's the question of the internal dynamics among gambling-related stakeholders, but then there's also the reality that sports betting is almost never going to have its hand on the wheel. It's never going to be in control of its own legislative destiny. Ultimately, it's largely going to be subject to broader whims and wills of the political environment in any given state, as opposed to having its own straight shot to passage.
Yeah, and then the public attitude too, right, Chris? In other words, in a place like California or Texas, if the public doesn't want it for one reason or another, and sometimes that may come down to economic pressures with the state budget, right? Is that sort of in the mix too?
I think you're also in an environment, and this plays into the conversation around online casino expansion, which is subject to many of the same hurdles, and then an additional set of hurdles above and beyond what online sports betting has to get over. But the current environment is one where I would say that a lot of voters have shifted toward the negative when it comes to sports betting. If you were positive before, maybe now you're a little closer to neutral. If you were neutral before, maybe now you're a little closer to negative. If you're negative before, you're negativer or more negative. Now, we really are in the second full year of a very negative news cycle when it comes to how online sports betting was authorized, when it comes to the amount of advertising the typical consumer can see, when it comes to reporting on the perceived or potential harms of sports betting expansion. So I think that amount of negative coverage and negative talk in the broader cultural consciousness is now a new hurdle in terms of how voters are perceiving this opportunity that the remaining states are going to have to clear in order to get a sports betting bill done. And that wasn't the case for the first and second wave sports betting states, where you really did have largely positive voter sentiment toward the issue.
That's a good point. And, you Shohei Ohtani's interpreter, that whole explosion down in Southern California and over into Las Vegas, how that trickled into some potential laundering issues at Las Vegas casinos. You've got the Alabama baseball coach so you've got some issues. Has that played into it? That sort of publicity around some of those perceived negatives by the public. Does that play that sort of media coverage of those sort of issues pull some in the public back a little bit?
Certainly doesn't help. Obviously, always good to remember that the Ohtani situation is one that existed largely because of illegal sports books, as opposed to the legal and regulated online sports books that have proliferated across the U.S. But again, if you are neutral on this topic as a voter, maybe those stories give you pause. Maybe those give you a reason to have a negative impression of regulated sports betting, despite all the arguments on the other side of the scale for why it may be a net positive. And unfortunately, I don't think we've seen the last of those stories. The Ohtani case is going to continue to unfurl. The Porter case is going to continue to unfurl. And look, the reality of it is there's unfortunately no shortage of supply of stupid people doing stupid things. And a fair number of those are going to intersect with our industry, and they help to provide additional fuel to that negative media coverage. And that, again, creates just another hurdle to get bills done in states that haven't passed illegal online sports betting yet.
Yeah, like you say, some of the argument on the other side, which I know a lot of legislators and lawmakers in places like North Carolina and Kentucky and places like that, conservative, states where there has been some pushback, or was prior to legalization, was the whole offshore, illegal, unregulated tax money going next door. I know Missouri is going through that now, and others were sending tax money next door overseas. So it does seem like a push and pull. And along those lines too, let me ask you, Chris. There seems to have been a shift in some of the dialogue around sports betting now to some taxation issues. With the New York 51%, and in other states are looking at Illinois and others jacking it up. And you've got the handle tax, Dina Titus, in your state. Now that's moved over in some Senate legislation, companion legislation. You've got DraftKings now involved in that surcharge on winning bets in some of the bigger states. Is that kind of a broader question, Chris? Is that sort of where this conversation is going now? Is it going now to lawmakers? I know they always think it's safer for them to hit sin taxes, as they call them, and that sort of thing. Are we looking now at sort of nibbling around the margins on surcharging on winning bets, on taxation on gaming revenue? Is that sort of the discussion now?
I think that will be a significant part of the conversation going forward. I don't know that you're going to see every state, and maybe not many or most states, follow Illinois' example. But the reality is that the industry set the stage for this by effectively negotiating with New York and accepting a 51% tax rate. So whatever the outcome of this process is, they have no one to blame but themselves. When they set that as the baseline, obviously, New York is a large market, a substantial market, and in many ways set apart from other individual states that have lower populations. But the reality is, once that was set as the ceiling, states that were closer to the floor, roughly 6%, I think it's 6.75% in Nevada, if I remember right, is still the lowest tax rate. It was inevitable that states were going to say, well, why not us? So I think that will be part of the conversation going forward. But I also don't know that just because Illinois did it means that you're going to see this rapid march by other states in that direction. I think of it more as, let's call it a center of gravity. And that's the direction that tax rates are going to drift in over time. Doesn't mean it happens immediately, but we do know one thing: tax rates almost never go down for regulated gambling. So if they move in any direction, they are likely to drift up. And the place that they're likely to drift up to is that ceiling that's been set by a market where operators have explicitly or implicitly acknowledged that they can still operate profitably in that market. Maybe that's not New York at 51, that's Pennsylvania in the high 30s. Whatever it is, there's a ceiling that's far above that 20% tax rate that Jason Robbins indicated on a recent earnings call he's looking to pull his blended tax rate down to, whether that's through getting state laws changed, difficult to impossible, or passing some of those costs on to the consumer, easier to do, but a little less predictable in terms of the impact and the blowback it might cause.
And does that, when states next legislative session get through this election, I know it's always tough in election year for any kind of gaming legislation to pass. And so once this election's over, and then next legislative sessions, the Alabamas, the Georgias, the Texas, whatever, whoever may come on board down the road, do they then look at those higher tax rates like New York and say, you know what, let's go ahead and reach for that level? Does that become part of the debate in those states too?
Yes. Shortest answer you'll get to any question.
No, I get it. Yeah,
that's it.
It's a target that it's tough for lawmakers to raise property and sales taxes, and they seem to go after that. If you would, let me ask you too, Chris. One of the things that's topical now, really recently, is DraftKings looking at. I know we talked about that handle tax that's in Congress that dates back to the 50s, and there's an effort to take that off the books. So there could be some relief if that gets through at some point. But on to the DraftKings issue, where there will be an effort to stick a surcharge on winning bets in the states with the bigger tax. Speaking of bigger tax rates, I know it's just popping. Where do you see down the road? Is DraftKings going to pull back from that? Will some of their competitors say, hey, you know what, we need to get on board with that? I know it's a crystal ball thing at this point, but where does that go?
I think Jason Robbins, DraftKings CEO Jason Robbins, is definitely expecting his competitors to follow in whole or in part. I think the logic that he articulated on the earnings call was something along the lines of, we looked at this issue, we concluded that it made sense for us to do it, so we think that our competitors are going to come to a pretty similar solution. In his defense, it's not as if this is without example, without precedent in other segments of our economy. If you think about Las Vegas, for example, whether it's resort fees or whether it's parking charges or whether it's the vanishing of reasonable payback blackjack games and low limits from the strip, or the airline that you took to get there, or the Uber that you took to get from the airport to your hotel, we definitely live in a society where fees are the new black, right? So it's not as if he is out on a limb in terms of the general experience that consumers have when they move through the world. It is a fee-laden experience. He's also correctly, I think, gauging that he's in a competitive environment where his competitors do need to pull more down to the bottom line and may not necessarily be interested in engaging in effectively a price war in order to win share and win a very specific slice of share, by the way, probably not a representative slice of share. I don't know how that will shake out, but it seems that that's the fundamental logic of DraftKings coming out first, announcing this decision, is that they do expect competitors to follow. And again, I don't think that expectation is wildly off base or without precedent. It's speculative. You could certainly see a world in which he's creating room for a FanDuel, and I think it would primarily be FanDuel, not a Caesars or a BetMGM, who would be likely to pounce on this opportunity, pounces on the opportunity and says, we're the home of no fees. We love the bettors. Come over here. We don't know what those guys are doing. They've lost their minds. Here's your new home. That certainly could happen, but it could also be that everyone in the industry looks at each other and goes, higher margins, that does sound pretty good. Thanks for taking the heat on that one, Jason. We'll be following quickly behind.
Yeah, and you know this a lot better than I do. I think the average bet with now you got the big heavy bettors, clearly but the average, the sports books you and I go into and see in Las Vegas and on our phones and everything I think the average bet, correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, around $35 or so. I'm talking about the average person who would drop by the sports book, have a beer, and watch a couple of games. Will it matter to those people? well, I know, again, this is tough to foresee. It's like the new kickoff rule in football. We're not going to know until it's implemented. Will that matter to those bettors that there's a surcharge on a winning bet?
It'll matter to some. And again, the question of how much it matters is going to come down to, I think, two or three things. First, is everyone else doing it? Because if everyone else is doing it, then there's not really much of an option. You complain and you move on. Second, let's go back to the Vegas parking example. How many ways are there around the surcharge? If you're at a certain tier of the VIP program, do you escape the surcharge? If you've placed a certain number of bets, just like you have to order a certain amount from Amazon to qualify for, say, same-day shipping, does that get you around the surcharge? So how many people have a way that they can or perceive that they can get around the surcharge? And then I think the third thing really is, how's it presented and how does it occur in tandem with other promotions, offers, or benefits that might soften the blow of that surcharge? Those are the three things I think you really have to look to appreciate how the surcharge is going to play out and how it's going to impact consumer behavior. If everyone's offering it, if there are ways around it, and if there's some kind of corresponding increase in promotional generosity, new features, the sense that I'm getting something back for what I'm paying, I think for better or for worse, a lot of consumers will complain and move on as opposed to significantly altering their behavior. But as you said, we will not know until we see. And based on Robin's comments on the earnings call, it does seem that we will get to see. They do seem committed to this. They have planted a stake in the ground. They had the opportunity to be more ambiguous, to make this a little more of a trial balloon. And that doesn't feel like the position they've staked out, at least not to my ears.
Did it surprise the industry that popped out?
There was definitely surprise, I think, among players. This wasn't something we'd seen telegraphed by Jason Robbins, at least. You will remember in the conversation around the Illinois tax increase, there were rumblings, not, I think, from DraftKings directly, but from, I think it was the SBA or other representatives of DraftKings or their lobbying arms that said, hey, you raise taxes here, and there's a chance we're not going to have any option but to pass that cost on to consumers. So that rhetoric was in the air. This specific way of passing it on to consumers, relatively novel, not anticipated. But I honestly don't think it's the last iteration that we're going to see in the general strategy of how do sportsbooks make money from customers. I don't think that any of these sportsbooks, especially the publicly traded ones, are in a position to be content with only having that one primary revenue stream of we get to keep the difference between the amount bet and the amount paid out. I think they're going to be looking for other ways to monetize the customers they have, whether that's subscription-based products, whether that's advertising, or whether it's the door number 3 that we have to open to see what's behind it. This is not the last example of unique ways to monetize customer bases that we're going to see out of U.S. sportsbooks.
And that's a good parallel with the Las Vegas casinos, from resort fees, parking fees to, I know you and I remember back when the Mirage opened in '89, and before then, you know, you could drive up, you could leave your car at valet, or you still can do that, but then there are fees now, resort fees and those sort of things that have built, and there's still some anecdotal and residual pushback from some customers about that. So yeah, as it builds, it begins to take on a life of its own, if that's a fair parallel, in ways to increase revenue. So it's going to be interesting to watch, Chris. Let me transition, if we could. Overall, clearly these tax issues and these revenue issues are going to be getting a lot of the spotlight in the industry. How do you see, Chris, just in general, the sports betting industry in the U.S. or overseas, offshore? How do you see it evolving? Are there some things from micro betting to global expansion to other ways that globally, even, Chris, the industry can evolve and expand and reach new customers?
One of the trends I think we're seeing play out in real time in the U.S. is the evolution of the sports betting product away from the big board that you and I are accustomed to in a Las Vegas sportsbook, futures, spreads, totals, into more of a game, into something that more closely resembles what we think of as a capital G game, kind of app you might install on your phone, open up and play for a couple of minutes while you're waiting for a ride or standing in line. I think there really is an emphasis, both for reasons of being able to secure higher hold with games where pricing tends to be less transparent, where the entertainment value may be higher, so customers are more willing to absorb a higher hold rate, but also because you just have now, look, you had a generation who are probably some of the primary customers for DraftKings, FanDuel, et al. At this point, who grew up and at every stage in their life following growing up have had a video game console in the home, right? So that's one generation. And a couple generations below that, you've got this emerging group of customers who grew up and for most of their lives have had the ability to take out their phone and play a game on that. You really do have this broader macro trend of entertainment being expressed through this form factor of games, and increasingly small, short duration, highly engaging games. It makes sense that sports betting would move at least part of the product set in that direction, especially because in the US, online casino feels far way off in the states that don't already have it. So there is going to be just this broader pressure to think about how can we reformat the sports betting experience to get closer to something that resembles a casino experience and get more revenue, more margin, and access to more customers in the meantime.
Now, what kind of games would those be, Chris? For example, that's fascinating. How that could evolve, and especially with as you say, the generation now that is, it's absolutely it's muscle memory now. It's all part of the world we all live in. What sort of games would, for instance, would those be?
Well, same game parlay is one of those games today, more or less. That's certainly the direction that it's moving in, where there's not necessarily a lot of research or analysis involved, although you can do research and analysis, but prepackaged parlays that hit infrequently and are more jackpot based. I mean, realistically, if you drew a continuum and you put a classic straight bet on this side, and you put a slot machine on the other side, depending on how you think about it, an SGP, especially the way the product is moving, I'm not entirely sure where it falls in between those two poles, but it's probably somewhere in the middle and maybe inching in the direction of being closer to a slot machine. So I think we're going to be looking at games that have characteristics including low to no decision making, low to no clicks, highly entertaining and engaging, very visual in their presentation, and perhaps most importantly, high volatility, high hold. I think those are the kinds of games that if I'm a DraftKings or a FanDuel, I'm thinking about how can I get creative with underlying sports outcomes to drive some new form factors that, again, don't ask much of my consumers. They're not time intensive. They're not research intensive. They're easy to use. There's no learning curve. No one is going to feel silly or like they're making the wrong decision. Everyone's going to feel like they're playing a game. They're going to lose almost all the time. When they win, it's going to be a very exciting win. That's the high volatility part. And then because the stakes are relatively low, when they lose, they'll likely brush it off. We're also describing characteristics that more or less fit the evolution of the American lottery and where that product has gone over the last few decades. So it will tap into a broader consumer affinity and a broader consumer familiarity with that kind of gameplay style and risk reward ratio.
That's absolutely sounds fascinating. I'd love to see some of that too. And we're seeing some of it with the brick and mortar sports books. I'm thinking this is a Las Vegas reference, and I know a lot of the audience may not have been to Las Vegas, but like Circa, Derek Stevens at Circa with the multi-deck sports book, the outdoor at Stadium Swim, the outdoor.
Yep.
There may be some evolution too with the brick and mortar experience. Listen, I was just at the sports book at Resorts World, and I love it. I love sitting. I love the traditional experience too, but maybe there's a way to sort of address that issue too, and bring in some more different twist on that experience. I know FanDuel's got a sports book now at front at Fremont downtown, and there may be some more ways to interact with all of that. Thank you, Chris, for taking the time. Before we wrap up, let me sort of transition, if we can, as we talk about how things are evolving. Half dozen or so states now have online casino gambling, craps. Slots are huge everywhere. Obviously, they're taking, as you know, in Las Vegas casinos, they're taking poker rooms out and craps tables and everything out, putting more and more slots in. Plaza's got a no smoking slots area now. So all of that online could bring more players involved who aren't as interested maybe in sports betting as seen in a half dozen states or so that have both online sports betting. I'm sorry, online casino games. iGaming, iCasino does very well. However, there's pushback from some of the traditional brick and mortars, want people inside. Is there a way to, what happens going forward with iGaming, iCasino, whatever you want to call it? What does that expand? Is that the next frontier for big expansion in the U.S., especially the U.S. Gaming market, Chris? And how do you get beyond, not you, the generic you, but how does a company get beyond the this is anti brick and mortar? We want people inside the casino.
I think the path ahead for online casino expansion is incredibly difficult, incredibly fraught. And I think that's borne out by how long of a ramp we've had since New Jersey went live in November of 2013 through now, and how few states have followed New Jersey, despite the fact that New Jersey has been a resounding success by any measure. You look at the size of that market, you look at the tax revenue generated, you look at the scant evidence to demonstrate that online has been anything but complementary for the state's operators, at least in the aggregate. And then you also look at the fact that New Jersey's interplay between online casino and online sports betting has pushed both products to greater heights than either would reasonably achieve on their own. And then the wrapper around all of that is that former director David Rebuck and his team did an excellent job of creating a structure for that kind of gaming to exist within that, by all accounts, was safe, secure, reliable, worked out issues like underage play, made sure that geolocation worked, so on and so forth. So here you have this great model for how to do it right, how it can be very successful and also lucrative for the states that authorize it, yet you do not see many other states following. The number of reasons why, as numerous as the number of states who have yet to authorize online casinos. Sometimes it is how local stakeholders think about the opportunity. Sometimes it is, again, the voters are just not that interested in this kind of gambling expansion and have arguably legitimate questions about the impacts of that kind of gambling expansion. So in the alternative, I think you see operators who are focused on the digital opportunity and who have staked a part of their future, in some cases, maybe all of their future, on the digital opportunities, DraftKings, a FanDuel, but even look at MGM, a Caesars, they've made substantial promises to the market about how the digital business is going to underpin profitability going forward. I think they do two things. One, as we just talked about, they look at their sports betting product because that's, some 36 plus states and growing. I think you'll get more sports betting states in the next couple of years than you will online casino states, despite the fact that there's already better than a 6-1 advantage there. So they look at those states, they look at how sports betting's been authorized, and they ask themselves, what kinds of products can I build here that get as close to replicating the casino experience as possible within that existing authorization? And look, this is a big part of the history of regulated gambling in America. You look at what you want to do, and then you look at what you legally can do, and you find a way to square that circle. And we've seen it happen with, look, anything can be turned into a slot machine, apparently. Bingo can be turned into a slot machine. Horse racing can be turned into a slot machine. I'm sure sports betting can be turned into a slot machine or something like it. And the longer we go without a material number of meaningful states authorizing online casino, the more creative the industry is going to get and the more willing they're going to be to push the envelope on that front. I also think you'll see more operators look to where FanDuel has already looked for expansion, additional products that have casino-like attributes outside of the traditional regulated sphere. So if you think about what FanDuel has done with skill-based games, that's an example of a product that allows them to offer more games than they would offer under their online sportsbook, allows them to access a bunch of states that don't already have online casino, and allows them to do so without online casino needing to be authorized in any additional states. So I think you'll see regulated operators, again, start to look at what else can we do? If we're not going to get traditional online casino, what are the other ways that we can achieve that? And it's either through expanding the sportsbook product under existing authorizations or to looking to those adjacent verticals like skill, like sweepstakes, and finding ways there that they can get the growth that will at least give them some of what they might be able to capture if you did get online casino authorization in more states.
So to oversimplify, maybe there's my oversimplification. Maybe there's a down the road at some point you'll pick up your phone, go onto a commercial sports betting operator's existing platform reconfigured. You can do horse racing, you can do sports betting. There will be some slots opportunity, slots-ish opportunity,
Slots-ish. Yes, that's it.
perhaps-ish opportunity, or on one app.
Yep, I think that's right. I think a lot of ish, to borrow your suffix. I think that where there's a will, there's a way, and there's absolutely a will. So if we don't get online casino via the traditional method of the legislature authorizing it, I think you're going to find operators willing to look for other ways to get to a similar end, more customers, more revenue and EBITDA opportunity from those customers. And that's going to come via the ish, as you put it.
My words. Chris Grove, thank you so much for taking the time. I really do appreciate you joining us today. I'm Larry Henry at Gambling.com. Thank you for joining us on The Edge. Thanks, Chris.
All right. Thank you, Larry.